There's a specific kind of silence that still makes me flinch. It's not the silence of an empty room, and it's not the silence of space, which isn't really silence at all, just distance. It's the silence of a comm channel that should have a voice on it and doesn't. These days, when a radio clicks and nothing comes through, my whole body goes still before my brain catches up. I used to think that was just nerves. Now I know it's something my body learned the hard way, on a moon most people back home have never heard of, working a job I never applied for. My name is Mara Osei. 6 months ago, I was a junior translator for the Coalition Diplomatic Corps, which is a fancy way of saying I proofread other people's apologies in 6 different alien grammars and made sure nobody accidentally declared war by using the wrong verb tense. It was not glamorous work. It was, however, mine, and I was good at it, and for a while that felt like enough. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because it matters for what comes later. I did not dream of adventure. I did not lie awake wanting to prove myself to anyone. What I wanted, if you'd pinned me down and asked, was simpler and smaller than that. I wanted, just once, to be sent somewhere on purpose. My whole career up to that point had been a string of postings that happened to me rather than postings I earned. A slot opened, my name was next on a list, and off I went. I had started to suspect that if I disappeared entirely, the Corps would simply promote the next name up and never notice the difference. So when the transfer notice came through with my name on it and the words outpost called as reach, embedded liaison, Ithri Guard detachment, I let myself feel something I probably shouldn't have. I felt chosen. I found out how wrong that feeling was almost immediately, but not in the way you're expecting. Let me back up. The Ithri are one of 4 species in the Coalition, and out of all of them, they are the ones humans understand the least, even though we've worked beside them for almost 30 years. Physically, they're not that alarming. Tall, yes, maybe 7 feet at the shoulder, with long limbs and skin like brushed pewter that shifts faintly with mood, but nothing about their bodies should have unsettled me the way their behavior did. Here is the thing about the Ithri that took me weeks to really absorb, even though the briefing packet explained it on page 1. The Ithri do not think alone. Not prefer not to. Cannot. Every adult Ithri carries a neural implant called, in their language, something that translates roughly to the chorus. It links them, in real time, to every other Ithri within a few kilometers. Thoughts don't cross the link, not exactly, but intention does, urgency does, consensus does. When an Ithri Guard unit moves, it moves like one animal with 12 bodies, because in the way that matters, it basically is one animal with 12 bodies. To the Ithri, making a serious decision alone isn't brave. It's a kind of malfunction. Their word for someone who acts without the chorus's agreement is the same word they use for a limb that's gone numb and started twitching on its own. It's not an insult, exactly. It's closer to pity. I didn't know any of this the day I stepped off the transport at Calder's Reach with my duffel bag and my very optimistic haircut. What I knew was that the moon Yeshni orbits a gas giant called Orin, that the outpost was a joint listening post and diplomatic way station on a trade route the Coalition shared uneasily with a splinter faction called the Rennick Concord, and that I was supposed to report to a captain sailor van of the Ithri Guard. The air in the shuttle bay smelled like recycled metal and the faint ozone tang that Ithri equipment always carries. I hitched my bag up on my shoulder and looked around for someone holding a sign with my name on it, the way you do when you're new somewhere and still believe people do that. Nobody was holding a sign. What I got instead was 11 Ithri Guards, in full dark plating, turning to look at me all at exactly the same moment, like a wave breaking in one direction. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even really unfriendly. It was just perfectly, unnervingly synchronized, and I understood in my gut, before I understood it in my head, that I had just walked into a room that thought as a single mind, and I was the only person in it who didn't. A woman. I'd later learned the Ithri don't really map onto our gender categories cleanly, but she used she and her translator rendered her voice as low and even, stepped forward. Her plating carried a captain's mark, a pale spiral etched near the collar. "You are the liaison," she said. Not a question. "Mara Osei," I said, and held out a datapad, because that's what you do, apparently, in every branch of the service, human or otherwise. Reporting as assigned. She didn't take the pad. She looked at it, then at me, the way you might look at a form that's been filled out in the wrong color ink. Correct information, wrong delivery. "You will slow us down," she said. Still not unkind. Just a fact, delivered the way you'd tell someone it's raining. I want to tell you I had a clever response ready. I didn't. I said, "I'll try not to," which is possibly the least impressive thing a person has ever said while accepting a new assignment, and Captain Sailorvan turned without another word and the rest of the detachment turned with her, all 11 of them pivoting on some signal I couldn't hear or see, and I followed the only way I knew how, which was to walk fast and hope nobody left me behind on purpose. That was the first afternoon. I want to sit in it a moment longer before I move on, because everything that happened later only makes sense if you understand how completely alone I felt in that corridor, trailing a unit that moved like a single held breath, knowing that whatever the chorus was murmuring between them right then, it did not include me, and never would. I should say something about who I was before all this, because the person who stepped off that transport isn't quite the same one telling you this story now, and the difference matters. Back on Earth, I grew up in a house where decisions got made by committee, not formally, nothing so official as that, just a family of 5 who talked everything to death before anyone acted on anything, from what to have for dinner to whether my sister should take the scholarship in another city. I loved that about my family, and I also, quietly, resented it, the way you can love a thing and still feel smothered by it. I used to daydream, as a teenager, about a version of my life where I got to decide something entirely on my own, with nobody's input, and live with whatever came of it, good or bad, as long as it was actually mine. I tell you that because it's funny, in hindsight, that the universe apparently took note and shipped me to the one posting in the entire coalition where an alien species had built an entire civilization around never doing exactly the thing I'd always secretly wanted to do. I didn't know that yet, standing in that shuttle bay. I only knew that the room I'd walked into didn't seem to need me, and that feeling, of being surplus to requirements, present but not necessary, was not a new one. It was, if I'm honest, the same feeling that had followed me through every posting the Corps had ever handed me, the low, persistent hum of being a name on a list rather than a person anyone had specifically wanted. My quarters that first night were barely large enough to turn around in. A cot, a fold-down desk, a single porthole looking out over Yeshny's grey, cratered plain toward the enormous curved wall of Oren's rings. I remember sitting on the edge of that cot with my duffel bag still half unpacked, listening to the outpost's ambient hum, the recyclers, the distant clank of the barracks 2 domes over, and thinking that I had never in my life felt further from anyone. I didn't cry, for the record, though I want to say I understand why someone might have. What I did instead was pull out my datapad and start reading everything the Corps had on file about the Ithri, cover to cover, twice, the way I'd always handled feeling useless, by trying to become the most prepared person in the room, even if the room didn't especially want me in it. It's a habit that's gotten me both into and out of a great deal of trouble since, and this story, as it turns out, is mostly about both halves of that at once. Calder's reach was smaller than I expected. 3 sealed domes connected by tube corridors, sitting on a grey plain under the enormous, banded bulk of Oren hanging in the sky like something that shouldn't be allowed to look that close. Dome 1 held the diplomatic offices and my new, closet-sized quarters. Dome 2 held the Ithri barracks and their training floor. Dome 3 held the relay station, the outpost's actual reason for existing, a listening post that kept watch on Concord shipping lanes and, more importantly, kept a communications bridge open between 3 coalition systems that otherwise couldn't talk to each other directly. My job, on paper, was straightforward. I was there to translate, to smooth friction between the Ithri detachment and the handful of human and coalition staff who rotated through, and to file reports back to the Corps about how the joint posting was functioning. In practice, for the first 2 weeks, my job was mostly to be quietly, thoroughly unnecessary. The Ithri didn't need a translator in the way I'd expected. Their standard language proficiency was excellent. What they needed, according to the assignment brief, was someone who could help them interpret human behavioral context, which is a diplomatic way of saying someone to explain why the human engineers kept getting offended when the guards walked through a room without acknowledging them. I tried to explain that to Sailor Van on my 3rd day, cornering her, or attempting to corner someone 7 feet tall who did not want to be cornered, near the barracks entrance. They think you're ignoring them, I said. When the detachment doesn't greet people, it reads as contempt, even if that's not what it is. Sailor Van considered this the way she considered most things I said, with a pause just long enough to make me wonder if she was actually listening or waiting for me to finish so she could get back to something that mattered. We are not ignoring them, she said. We are occupied. With what? With each other, she said, and there was something almost like patience in it, the patience of someone explaining water to a person who has never been wet. You hear one voice when I speak to you. I hear 11, always, including my own. When I walk through a room, I am already listening to 10 conversations that are not yours. This is not contempt. It is simply that you are not in the room I am actually standing in. I turned that over for a long time afterward. It was, I think, the moment I stopped being annoyed at the Ithri and started being genuinely curious about them, which turned out to be a much more dangerous thing to be. The chorus, I learned from the technical officer, a woman named Priya Chandrasekharan who ran the relay station and had clearly given up trying to make friends with the guard detachment years ago, worked through a small subdermal node at the base of the skull. It didn't transmit words. It transmitted something closer to weather, mood, alarm, agreement, hesitation, and the Ithri brain had evolved, or been engineered, generations back, to parse that weather the way ours parses tone of voice. And Ithri alone for too long got what they called thin, a kind of low-static anxiety, the same anxious a human gets from isolation, except sharper, because to them, being alone wasn't just lonely. It was actually, biologically, being less complete. So they never decide anything by themselves, Priya said, not looking up from her console. Not really. Not big things. It's not that they're not smart enough. It's that acting alone is, to them, basically the same as acting recklessly. There's no daylight between those two ideas in Ithri culture. You act alone, you've already made a mistake, because you didn't wait to hear if anyone disagreed. That seems like it would make them slow, I said. It makes them almost never wrong, Priya said. 11 minds catch things one mind misses. It also means if you cut that link, even for a minute, she trailed off and shrugged, like she didn't have the end of the sentence and didn't want to guess at it. I didn't push. I wish, looking back, that I had. For the first month, the closest I came to being useful was fixing things nobody had asked me to fix. This was less a virtue and more a symptom of having almost nothing else to do. There was an old relay dish on the roof of Dome 3, decommissioned years before I arrived, that Priya mentioned once in passing as basically dead weight up there, not worth the parts to strip it. I don't know why that stuck with me. Maybe because it was the one piece of the outpost nobody was actively using, which made it feel, oddly, like the one piece that might actually be mine. I spent evenings up there instead of in the mess hall, which the Ithri didn't use anyway. They ate together, of course, all at once, on some chorus time schedule that had nothing to do with the clock. I ran diagnostics on the old dish out of boredom more than purpose. Its primary transmitter was fried beyond saving, but its backup line, an old analog hybrid bridge meant for emergencies, was intact. It just needed power routed to it and someone patient enough to recalibrate the alignment by hand, which nobody at Calder's reach had bothered to be, because the outpost already had a perfectly good primary relay and nobody plans for the day the good one fails. I got it working over about 3 weeks, in scraps of free time, mostly because it gave me something to point at when I filed my reports that wasn't just the Ithri detachment continues to function excellently without my help. I told Sailor Van about it once, in passing, expecting nothing. She looked at the dish, then at me, and said, "Why?" Not why did you fix it? Just why, the way you'd ask someone why they were carrying a rock around. Because it was broken, I said, and I don't like broken things sitting around not being fixed. She studied me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read yet. I hadn't learned to read Ithri faces the way I eventually would, and then she said something that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. You did this with no one to tell you it was worth doing. I mean, yeah. That is either very brave, she said, or the beginning of a very bad habit, and walked away before I could decide which one she meant. By the second month, I had settled into something that wasn't quite belonging but wasn't quite exile either. The guard detachment still didn't include me in the way I'd naively hoped, but they'd stopped treating me like weather to be endured. There's a specific, small satisfaction in going from invisible to occasionally acknowledged, and I clung to it harder than I probably should have. The Ithri I got to know best, aside from the captain, was a guard named Doran Kesh, one of the younger members of the detachment, still developing the pale collar markings that came with rank. Doran Kesh had the kind of restlessness that I recognized immediately because I'd had it myself at that age. Competent, eager, chronically unconvinced that competence was the same thing as being trusted. They still check with the others before agreeing with me about anything, Doran Kesh told me once, low-voiced, during a rare moment when the rest of the detachment was occupied elsewhere and the chorus's pull on them, for lack of a better way to put it, had eased. Even when I am right. That must be frustrating, I said. It is correct, Doran Kesh said, which wasn't an answer to what I'd said, but was, I realized, an answer to something underneath it. The chorus does not care if I am right alone. Alone is not a category that means anything to us. You are either heard, or you are thin. I asked what thin felt like, expecting a metaphor. I got something closer to a wince. Like standing outside in weather with no coat, Doran Kesh said. You would call it loneliness. It is not only that. It is also doubt. Not doubt of the world. Doubt of yourself. When I am cut from the others, even for a moment, I do not trust my own judgment. Why would I? I have never had to. There has always been someone to weigh it against. I didn't understand, not really, not yet, what that meant for a species facing a crisis. I filed it away the way you file away a piece of trivia, interesting but not urgent, and went back to my actual work, which by that point had expanded slightly beyond translation into what Priya generously called utility functions, helping recalibrate equipment, running supply audits, generally being the one person on the outpost with enough free time and curiosity to fix things nobody else had gotten around to. The first real test of anything came in week 9, and it was small enough that I almost don't count it as a turning point, except that it was the first time the detachment watched me do something instead of just tolerating my presence in the room. A pressure seal failed in the equipment locker outside Dome 2. Not catastrophic, nothing that put anyone in danger, but the kind of failure that, left alone for a few hours, would have frozen half the guard unit's spare atmospheric gear solid. It happened at an odd hour, the deep night shift, when most of the detachment was resting and only 2 guards were on watch. Both of them noticed the alarm. Neither of them moved. I found this out because I was awake, badly sleeping, as I often was those first months, still adjusting to Yeshni's short, wrong-feeling nights, and I heard the alarm through the corridor and went to look, mostly out of the same restless curiosity that had gotten the old relay dish working. The 2 guards on watch were standing in front of the failed seal, plainly aware something was wrong, doing absolutely nothing about it. What's happening? I asked, already reaching for the emergency panel. We are waiting, one of them said. For what? For the others to wake and confirm the response. I stood there for a second, genuinely stunned, staring at a hissing pressure seal and 2 capable, armored guards standing 3 feet from it like it was a painting they were admiring. It's going to freeze your gear before they wake up, I said. Then it will freeze, the guard said, in a tone that wasn't defiance, wasn't stubbornness. It was closer to serenity, the calm of someone who genuinely believed that acting without consensus was a worse outcome than losing the equipment. I understood, dimly, that I was looking at the edge of something much larger than a broken seal. But in the moment, mostly what I felt was simple, unglamorous impatience. Well, I'm not Ithri, I said, so I don't have to wait for anyone, and I popped the panel and rerouted the backup seal myself, a 2-minute fix that any competent engineer could have done blind, and the hissing stopped, and the gear stayed fine, and the 2 guards watched me do it with an expression I can only describe as bewildered respect, the way you might watch someone casually catch a falling glass you'd already accepted was going to shatter. Word of that got around the detachment faster than I expected. Not because it was impressive, it wasn't, it was genuinely a small fix, but because of what it implied. I had acted alone, with total confidence, on a decision that to them required a chorus of agreement, and the moon hadn't ended. Nothing had gone wrong. If anything, waiting would have gone wrong, and acting had gone right. Doran Kesh found me the following evening, up on Dome 3's roof, where I'd taken to eating my rations alone most nights because the mess hall's chorus time schedule made me feel like a guest who'd wandered into someone else's family dinner. I hadn't expected company, and I definitely hadn't expected an Ithri Guard to fold themselves down onto the cold metal grating beside me without asking, which was, for the Ithri, apparently a much bigger gesture than it looked like. I have been thinking about the seal, Doran Kesh said, without preamble, which I was slowly learning was just how Ithri conversation often started. No small talk, no warming up, straight to the thing that actually mattered. The pressure seal? That was nothing. 2-minute fix. Not the fix. The waiting. Doran Kesh turned one of Yeshni's small loose stones over in a clawed hand, the kind of restless fidgeting I recognized from my own hands during long committee meetings back home. I have run that scenario every night since. I ask myself, if you had not been there, how long would we have stood in front of that seal? I do not like the answer I keep arriving at. You'd have woken the others eventually, I said. It would have been fine. Eventually, Doran Kesh repeated, testing the word like it tasted wrong. You do not understand what that word means to us, liaison. To you, eventually is an inconvenience, a delay. To us, it is the entire architecture of how we survive as a species. Someone will eventually confirm, someone will eventually agree, and until then, we hold. We are taught to trust that holding is safer than moving without the hole. I have never, not once in my training, been taught what to do if eventually simply does not come in time. I didn't have a tidy answer for that, so I offered the only thing I actually had, which was my own experience rather than any wisdom about theirs. Back home, I said, I used to hate that my family made every decision like a jury deliberation. Dinner, vacations, which university my sister should go to, everything got talked through by 5 people before anyone moved an inch. I used to think that was suffocating. It took me a long time to realize the reason I hated it wasn't that it was wrong. It was that I never learned how to trust my own judgment without checking it against someone else's first. I had to leave home and mess up a few decisions entirely on my own, badly, before I actually learned how. You are saying this is a skill, Doran Kesh said. Not simply a trait you were born with. I think it's both, I admitted. Some of it's just how my brain works, sure. But most of it, I think, is just practice. Deciding badly enough times that you stop being afraid of deciding at all. Doran Kesh was quiet for a long moment, watching Oren's banded shadow crawl slowly across the cratered plain below us. I would like to practice, they said finally, in a voice that sounded almost embarrassed to admit it. Quietly. Not where the others can see, at first. I do not think the detachment is ready to hear that one of its own wants to learn to think without them. I am not sure I am ready to hear it either. But I would like to try. I didn't know, sitting there in the cold with a half-eaten ration bar going stale in my lap, that I was having the exact conversation that would matter most 3 weeks later, when the chorus went silent and someone in that barracks needed to remember, fast, that thinking alone wasn't the same thing as failing. I just knew, in that moment, that it was the first time since I'd arrived on Yeshni that someone had asked to learn something from me instead of simply tolerating my presence in their room, and it felt, for the first time in 6 months, like being wanted somewhere on purpose. Sailor Van summoned me the next day, which I initially took as trouble. You repaired the seal without instruction, she said. It needed repairing, I said. There wasn't time to wait. There is always time to wait, she said. That is what waiting means to us. You do not understand this yet, but I will tell you something, liaison, and I want you to remember it. What you did last night was not brave to you. I could see that in how you told it. It was simply Tuesday. That is the strangest thing about your species. You call it initiative, like it is a skill you sharpened. To us, it looks like a reflex you were simply born with, the way you were born with 2 hands. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which turned out to be the correct response more often than I expected around Sailor Van. I am not saying this is better, she added, after a moment, in a tone that made clear she wasn't fully convinced of that either. I am saying it is different. And I have learned, in 40 years of service, that the moment you assume different is worse, is the moment it costs you something you can't get back. I didn't understand what she meant by that until 3 weeks later, standing in the wreckage of Dome 3 with the chorus jammed dead silent and 11 Ithri Guards frozen in place around me like a held breath that had nowhere left to go. The Rennick Concord was not, technically, at war with the Coalition. That's an important distinction, and one that mattered enormously to the people who wrote the treaties and mattered basically not at all to the people stationed on the border moons where the treaties got tested. The Concord was a splinter faction, a breakaway government that had spent a decade insisting it wanted peaceful trade rights while periodically sending ships to assert presence in contested lanes, which was a polite way of saying they liked to remind everyone they hadn't gone away. Calder's Reach existed specifically because of that lane. It watched Concord shipping, relayed data back to 3 systems that needed to coordinate around it, and otherwise sat quietly on Yeshni doing the diplomatic equivalent of standing very still so nobody mistook the outpost for a target. That strategy worked for exactly as long as it took the Concord to decide the outpost was worth removing. I found out something was wrong the way I found out most things at Calder's Reach, because I was awake at an hour I shouldn't have been, this time doing routine maintenance on my old relay dish out of pure habit, and I felt the ground shudder under the tripod legs before I heard the alarm. The first strike hit Dome 3 directly. Not the relay's main transmitter array. That would have been too obvious, too easy to retaliate against. It hit the power distribution node feeding the chorus repeater embedded in the dome structure, the local booster that kept the guard detachment's neural links strong across the whole outpost instead of just within line of sight of each other. I didn't understand the significance of that target in the first 30 seconds. I understood it very quickly after. I ran for Dome 2, where the barracks were, because that's where people were, and people are what you run toward in an emergency, whatever species they happened to be. What I found when I got there stopped me cold in the doorway. 11 Ithri Guards, in full armor, weapons in hand, standing in a loose formation in the middle of the barracks floor. Not fighting. Not moving. Standing, the way you'd stand at the edge of a pool you just realized had no water in it. "What's happening?" I said, to no one and everyone. Doran Kesh turned toward my voice, and even in the low emergency lighting I could see something in that face I'd never seen there before. Not fear, exactly, though there was fear in it. It was closer to vertigo. "The repeater is down," Doran Kesh said. "The chorus does not reach past this room." "So talk to each other," I said. "You're all standing right here." "We are within range of each other," Sailor Van said, stepping forward, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her. "We are not within range of the rest of the network. Half the detachment is on perimeter duty in Dome 1. We cannot hear them. They cannot hear us. The chorus is not 11 separate conversations. Liaison. It is one conversation, and right now it has been cut in half, and neither half can agree on anything, because agreement requires the whole." I want to be honest about how badly I misjudged the situation in that moment, because I think it's important. I thought, genuinely thought, that this was an inconvenience. A tactical problem, the kind any competent unit could root around with old-fashioned verbal communication, radios, hand signals, the tools every human military had relied on for centuries before anyone invented a neural link. It did not occur to me, standing in that doorway, that the problem wasn't the absence of a channel. The problem was that 11 extremely capable soldiers had, in that moment, functionally forgotten how to decide anything without one. "There are Concord landers inbound," came a voice over the room's local speaker, Priya, from the relay station, her voice thin and fast with adrenaline. "2 shuttles, small, fast. They're not here to shell us, they're here to board us. ETA 6 minutes. I need the guard detachment at the west airlock now, and somebody needs to get down to power distribution and reroute past the fried node or I lose the whole outpost's secondary systems in about 10 minutes, not just the repeater." 6 minutes. I looked at 11 guards standing in a room, weapons ready, capable of ending a boarding action in about 90 seconds under any other circumstances, and not one of them moved toward the door. "Sailor Van," I said. "West airlock. 6 minutes." "We do not have consensus," she said, and I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that she meant it literally. Not that they disagreed, but that the mechanism by which they usually confirmed agreement, the wordless weather of the chorus, simply wasn't there to check. 11 minds that had never in their lives had to decide something serious without hearing the others first, and for the first time in this crisis, in maybe years, they had to. "You have 5 minutes and 50 seconds, I said, "and I promise you, waiting isn't an option this time." Nobody moved. I felt something close to panic, the real kind, the kind that isn't dramatic, just very quiet and very fast underneath your ribs. And then I remembered the dish. I didn't think it through the way I'm laying it out now. In the moment, it was just an idea grabbing me by the collar and pulling. The old relay dish on Dome 3's roof, the backup analog hybrid bridge I'd spent 3 board weeks getting working for no reason at all except that broken things bothered me. It wasn't built for chorus signal, but it was built for close-range emergency broadcast, the kind of dumb, brute-force radio relay that doesn't care what kind of brain is listening on the other end. "Doran Kesh," I said, "does the chorus repeater run on the same frequency band as your armor comms?" "Similar," Doran Kesh said, staring at me like I'd asked something in a language they didn't speak, which, in a way, I had. "Similar is enough. Give me your comm unit." I didn't wait for permission. That, I think, is the part of this story that matters most, and I want to say it plainly instead of dressing it up. I didn't wait for permission, because there was no time to get any, and because somewhere in the last 2 months I had quietly stopped believing that waiting was always the responsible choice. I grabbed the comm unit off Doran Kesh's shoulder mount before anyone could object, and I ran. Behind me, I heard Sailor Van's voice rise, sharp and strained, calling my name once, and I didn't stop, because stopping was the one thing I genuinely couldn't afford. My legs were already burning by the time I hit the corridor junction, my breath coming in ragged pulls that tasted like the ozone smell of Ithri equipment mixed with something sharper, something I'd later realize was smoke drifting in from the breach in Dome 3's outer shell. Every emergency light in the corridor had gone the deep amber of a station in crisis, and the low, grinding vibration under my boots told me the outpost structural integrity fields were working overtime to hold a hull that had never been built to take a direct hit. I passed 2 junior Ithri Guards near the junction to Dome 1, both of them standing exactly the way the pair at the pressure seal had stood weeks before, capable, armed, and utterly still, weapons half raised toward a threat they could clearly see and simply weren't moving against. One of them turned toward me as I passed, and I caught, for just a fraction of a second, an expression I recognized instantly because I'd worn it myself as a teenager waiting for my parents to weigh in on a decision I already knew the answer to. It wasn't cowardice. It was the specific, awful paralysis of a mind that has never once been asked to trust itself, meeting a moment that demanded exactly that and nothing else. Move if you can hear anyone at all, I shouted at them without stopping, not even sure if it would help, not even sure if my voice alone carried enough weight to matter to a species built to listen for something so much larger than one human throat. I didn't wait to see if they responded. I couldn't. The dish was still 2 corridors and 1 ladder away, and Priya's countdown was ticking every second I spent worrying about anything I couldn't fix in that instant. The corridor between Dome 2 and Dome 3 was maybe 90 seconds at a dead run, and I made it in what felt like 10. The way distance always compresses when your whole body is running on the specific fuel of I do not have time to be scared right now. Dome 3 was worse than I expected. The strike had torn a ragged gash through the outer maintenance shell near the base, and emergency bulkheads had already sealed off the primary relay chamber to keep atmosphere from bleeding out into vacuum. That meant the good relay, the one that actually mattered, was locked behind a door I had no time or tools to force open. It also meant I had exactly 1 working piece of equipment left in that dome, and it was mine, sitting up on the roof access ladder where I'd left it 2 nights before after a routine calibration check, because apparently even my hobbies had been rehearsing for this. I climbed the ladder faster than I've climbed anything in my life. The dish was intact, a small miracle, or maybe just bad luck for the Concorde's targeting, since nobody sane would have bothered aiming at a decommissioned backup unit nobody used. I popped the housing, jammed Doran Kesh's comm unit into the auxiliary feed port with hands that were shaking just enough to make the job twice as hard as it should have been, and started patching frequencies by feel, because there was no time to check a manual and honestly there never had been one for this particular Frankenstein setup anyway. Priya's voice crackled through my own earpiece, thin with strain. Mara, whatever you're doing, I've got maybe 3 minutes before I lose main power distribution too, the fried node's backing up voltage into a line it was never built to carry. I need 3 minutes, I said. Get to power distribution. I'll meet you there. I'm already there, she said. That's the problem. I need another set of hands and I'm the only warm body left in this dome who isn't currently having a religious crisis in the barracks. I finished the last patch, said a short, entirely non-religious prayer of my own, and hit the broadcast switch. What came out wasn't chorus signal. It couldn't be. I don't have the biology for that, and neither does any piece of equipment I could improvise in 6 minutes with spare parts and stubbornness. What came out was my own voice, human and small and completely without the wordless certainty the Ithri were used to hearing from each other, broadcast on the same band their armor comms used, patched at just enough strength to bridge the gap between Dome 2 and Dome 1 that the dead repeater had left open. This is Osei, I said, hearing my own voice shake and deciding not to care. Detachment, listen to me. Dome 1, Dome 2, I don't care which half of you this reaches, all of it, some of it, I need you to hear this. The repeater's down. You can't hear each other the way you're used to. I know that feels like the floor's gone out from under you. It hasn't. You still have hands. You still have training. You still have each other in the room you're actually standing in, even if it's not all of you.
C'est la vam.
Doran Kesh. West Airlock. Whoever's in Dome 1, hold the line. They're coming through the boarding tubes in under 3 minutes now. You don't need the whole chorus to know what to do. You already know what to do. You've known it your whole lives. You just usually let someone else say it first. I'm saying it first. Move. There was a pause on the other end that felt like it lasted several years and was probably about 2 seconds. Then Sailor Van's voice, sharp and suddenly, blessedly certain again, cut through on the same channel. West Airlock, on me. Kesh, take point. Move, now, all of you, move. I didn't stay to listen to the rest. I scrambled back down the ladder 2 rungs at a time and ran for power distribution, because Priya still needed a second set of hands and the boarding action, as urgent as it was, wasn't the only way this outpost could fail that night. I found her elbow deep in an access panel, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on her face, wrestling with a coupling that had backed up voltage exactly the way she'd warned it would. Cut off valve, she snapped, without looking up. Red housing, 12 o'clock from your position. I need it rotated a quarter turn the second I say go, and I need it done in under 4 seconds or this whole line arcs and takes the backup batteries with it. I found the valve. My hands were still shaking. I put them on it anyway. Ready, I said. Go. I turned it. 4 seconds, maybe 5, my grip slipping once on the sweat-slicked housing before I caught it again, and the pressure gauge beside Priya's head dropped from a screaming red into a manageable amber, and she let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since the first alarm. Okay, she said. Okay. That buys us the batteries. It doesn't buy us the boarding party. Through the wall, muffled by a dome's worth of steel and distance, I heard something that in the moment sounded like thunder and only later, piecing it together from the after-action reports, resolved into what it actually was, 11 Ithri Guards, reconnected not by any neural link but by one shaking human voice on a jury-rigged backup channel, meeting 2 Concorde boarding shuttles at the West airlock with the kind of coordinated violence that species had clearly been built, and trained, and trusted to deliver, once somebody simply told them it was all right to start without waiting for permission. It was over in under 2 minutes. I know that because Priya's console kept a timestamp, and I've looked at it more times than I probably should since. 2 minutes, from the moment Sailor Van said move to the moment the boarding shuttles disengaged and fled back toward whatever ship had launched them, badly damaged and clearly not expecting the resistance they got. I sat down hard on the floor of the power distribution room, back against a warm Condor housing, and found that my hands wouldn't stop shaking even though the emergency, as far as I could tell, was over. Hey, Priya said, crouching down next to me. Hey, you did that. I patched a radio, I said. That's it. That's all I did. No, she said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard from her before, something that sounded almost like awe, which was strange coming from someone as relentlessly unimpressed as Priya Chandrasekharan usually was. You talked 11 soldiers out of freezing. That's not the same thing as patching a radio, Mara. That's not the same thing at all. Nobody died. I want to say that clearly, up front, because the way this kind of story usually gets told, someone has to almost die for the lesson to land, and I don't want to borrow tragedy I didn't earn just to make the ending feel heavier. Nobody died. But it wasn't clean, either, and I think it's important to say that too. Doran Kesh took a glancing hit from a Concorde stun round during the airlock fight, the kind of hit that wouldn't kill an Ithri but would put them flat on their back for the better part of a day, muscles locked and half-conscious, unable to do anything but wait it out. When I found my way to the barracks infirmary afterward, Doran Kesh was propped against a cot, plating cracked along one shoulder, staring at the ceiling with an expression I still think about. You should be resting, I said, which is the kind of useless thing people say to each other in infirmaries. I am resting, Doran Kesh said. I am also thinking about how close we came to doing nothing at all. I didn't have an answer for that, so I sat down on the empty cot across from them and let the silence be the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. I want to tell you something, Doran Kesh said, after a while, and I want you to understand I am not saying it to flatter you. I have known my whole life that a mind alone is a mind at risk. Every lesson, every drill, every year of training told me this. Trust the chorus. Do not act until you have heard the others. It was not fear that kept us standing in that room while the Concorde came for us. It was faith. We had faith in a system, and the system went quiet, and none of us knew how to have faith in ourselves instead, because no one had ever asked us to. That's not your fault, I said. That's just how you were built. I know, Doran Kesh said. That is exactly what frightens me. If Concorde tacticians understood how completely we depend on that link, they would not need to defeat us in a fight. They would only need to make us quiet for 6 minutes, and let us defeat ourselves by standing still. You did not save us with a weapon, liaison. You saved us by being the one voice in the room who did not need the chorus's permission to keep talking. I thought about Sailor Van's words from weeks before. The moment you assume different is worse is the moment it costs you something you can't get back, and understood, for the first time, that she hadn't been talking about human weaknesses at all. She'd been talking about her own. I found her an hour later on the roof of Dome 3, standing next to my dented, jury-rigged relay dish, looking out at the wreckage of the outer shell where the strike had torn through, backlit by Oren's enormous banded shadow filling half the sky. She didn't turn when I climbed up beside her. I have led this detachment for 11 years, she said. In that time, I have never once given an order that was not first weighed by 10 other minds. I told myself this made me careful. Tonight I learned it also made me breakable, in a way I did not know how to defend against, because I never had to imagine defending against it. You moved the second you heard my voice, I said. That's not nothing. No, she said. It is something. But I want you to understand what it cost me to move on the word of one human, with no consensus behind it, in the middle of an attack. Every instinct I have told me that decision was reckless, that I should wait, verify, confirm. I moved anyway, because in that moment I had a choice between trusting a voice I could hear, or trusting a silence I could not. I chose the voice. I do not know yet if that was wisdom or simply desperation. I have not decided. Does it matter which? I asked. The outcome was the same either way. She was quiet for a long moment, the wind off Yeshni's thin atmosphere hissing faintly against the dome's outer plating. It matters to me, she said finally, because I built my entire life on the belief that a decision made without the whole is a decision made badly. Tonight the opposite was true, and I do not yet know what to do with a fact that contradicts everything I was raised to trust. I suspect I will be thinking about it for a very long time. For what it's worth, I said, I don't think it's about which way is right, consensus or one voice. I think it's about not being helpless when the one you're used to isn't there. Sailor Van finally turned to look at me, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen before, not quite warmth, not quite respect, something new that didn't have a name yet in either of our languages. That, she said, is either the wisest thing you have said since you arrived on this moon, or the most dangerous. I find, increasingly, that I cannot tell the difference between those two things where you are concerned. I laughed, more from exhaustion than humor, and for the first time since I'd stepped off that transport with my optimistic haircut and my hope of finally being sent somewhere on purpose, I let myself believe that maybe I actually had been. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself back in the infirmary, checking on Dor and Kesh one more time before turning in. They were awake, propped up against a folded blanket, watching the slow rotation of a diagnostic display without really seeing it. You are still awake, Dor and Kesh said, which from an Ithri recovering from a stun hit was less an observation than a mild accusation. So are you. I keep replaying the 6 minutes, they admitted. Not the fight. The part before it. Standing in that room, weapon in hand, doing nothing. I want to tell you it felt like fear. It did not. It felt like faith, exactly as I told you before, and that is the part one cannot make peace with yet. I had faith in a system that failed me, and for 6 minutes, I did not think to have faith in myself instead. I am trying to decide if that is a flaw in me, or simply a flaw in how I was raised, and I am not certain those are different things. Maybe they're not, I said. Maybe that's fine. You don't have to solve the whole question tonight. You survived it. That's enough for one day. Dor and Kesh looked at me for a long moment, the pale light of the diagnostic display catching the edge of their cracked shoulder plating. You say that so easily, they said, as though surviving without an answer is itself a kind of answer. It usually is, I said. It's most of what surviving anything actually looks like, honestly. You just keep going before you've figured out the whole shape of what happened to you. The figuring out comes later, if it comes at all. I sat with them a while longer, neither of us saying much else, and I remember thinking, somewhere in that quiet, that this was the first time an Ithri had let me simply be present for their uncertainty instead of their competence. The first time I'd been trusted with the unfinished, unresolved part of someone rather than only the parts they'd already made sense of. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like something quieter and, in its own way, more important than that. The days after an attack are always duller than the attack itself, and somehow harder to get through. Calder's Reach spent the next week patching the outer shell of Dome 3, running diagnostics on the fried repeater, and filing what felt like an endless stack of reports to 3 different coalition officers that all wanted the same information formatted 3 different ways. I filed mine last, mostly because I kept rewriting it. The Corps wanted a straightforward incident summary. I kept getting stuck on how to describe what had actually happened without making it sound either more heroic than it was or, worse, like an accusation against the detachment I'd come to genuinely respect. I settled, eventually, on the truth, which is usually the safest choice even when it's the least comfortable one. I wrote that the Ithri Guard detachment had performed with total effectiveness the moment coordination was restored, and that the vulnerability exposed by the attack was not a failure of training, courage, or skill, but a structural dependency shared by every chorus-linked unit in existence, a dependency the Concord had clearly identified and would clearly try to exploit again, on this moon or another one. I recommended, as gently as I could phrase it, that every Ithri unit posted along contested borders receive backup training in independent, single-operator decision protocols, not to replace the chorus, but to survive the gap when it failed. I recommended, further, that human liaisons be paired more deliberately with Ithri units specifically because of that gap, not despite it, since our entire species had spent its whole history solving exactly the problem the Ithri were only now being forced to face. I expected pushback. I got a summons instead, not from the Corps, but from Sailorvan, who read a copy of my report before I'd even finished transmitting it, because apparently very little happened at Calder's Reach that the detachment didn't hear about eventually, chorus or no chorus. "You called it a dependency," she said, when I arrived at the barracks. "Not accusing. Just checking the word, the way you check a blade for a nick before trusting it." "Because it is one," I said. "That's not an insult. Humans have dependencies too. We can't hear each other's intentions the way you do. We miss things a chorus would catch instantly. We've just had longer to build workarounds for our particular gap, because we've never had anything else." "You are suggesting we learn to be more like you." "I'm suggesting you learn to survive without the thing you usually lean on," I said. "The same way I've spent 6 months learning to survive without the thing your unit leans on. That's not becoming human. That's just becoming more complete." Sailorvan was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do before, not once in 6 months. She extended one long grey hand toward me, palm up, an Ithri gesture I recognized from the briefing packet as a formal request, not a greeting. Among the Ithri, it was the way you asked to be heard as an individual voice, outside the chorus, on equal footing. "Doran Kesh has already begun drafting a proposal for single-operator drills," she said. "Half the detachment thinks it is an admission of weakness. The other half has not stopped talking about the 6 minutes we could not hear each other, and does not want to spend even one more crisis standing still. I find, for the first time in 11 years of command, that I do not know which half is right. I would value your voice in that argument, not as a translator, as a colleague who has actually stood in the gap and knows what it costs to fill it." I took her hand. It felt strange. Ithri's skin ran cooler than mine, and her grip was gentle in a way I hadn't expected from someone who could have crushed my fingers without noticing. "I'd be glad to," I said. "There is one more thing," she added, before releasing my hand. "The relay dish. The one you repaired for no reason anyone asked you to repair." "What about it?" "I have submitted a formal request that it remain classified as active equipment rather than being stripped for parts," she said. "Priya Chandrasekharan agrees. We do not know when the chorus repeater will fail again. We know, now, what happens if we have nothing to lean on when it does. I would like this outpost to always have a second voice available, even if that voice belongs to someone who does not need permission to use it." I looked past her, out through the barracks viewport, to where the dish still stood on Dome 3's roof, dented but functional, silhouetted against the vast banded curve of Orin. It had been, for 3 board weeks, the most pointless project I'd ever taken on. I understood now that it hadn't been pointless at all. It had just been waiting for a reason nobody could have predicted, the way most things worth fixing usually are. 6 months after that night, I'm still at Calder's Reach. I could have transferred out, the Corps offered, almost apologetically, as though they expected me to want to leave the moon that had nearly gotten me killed. I didn't take the offer. I'm not sure I could explain to anyone back home exactly why, but I'll try to explain it here, since you've come this far with me. The detachment runs single-operator drills now, twice a month, alongside their chorus training, not instead of it. Doran Kesh leads half of them personally, having gone from the youngest, most restless guard in the unit to something like its resident expert on functioning alone, which still makes them laugh a little every time someone points it out. "I spent my whole life being told a mind alone is a mind at risk," they told me recently. "Now I spend 2 days a month teaching my own captain how to trust one." Sailor Van still leans toward consensus first, out of decades of instinct that don't unlearn themselves in half a year. But she stops herself now, sometimes visibly, in the middle of a decision, and I've watched her choose, deliberately, the way you choose a harder path because you know it's the more honest one, to act on her own judgment before checking it against anyone else's. She told me once that it still feels like standing on a floor she isn't sure will hold. I told her that's just what a decision feels like when nobody's guaranteed you the answer in advance. She said that sounded like an exhausting way to live. I told her it mostly was, but that you got used to the exhaustion, the same way you got used to gravity. The old relay dish is still up on Dome 3's roof. It's got an official designation now, a maintenance schedule, a line item in the outpost's equipment manifest. Priya still calls it Mara's junk pile affectionately, and I've stopped correcting her, because at this point the name has kind of stuck the way nicknames do. It hasn't had to save anyone again, not yet. I hope it never does. But I go up and check on it anyway, most weeks, out of the same restless habit that got it working in the first place, and some evenings Doran Kesh comes with me, and we sit up there in the thin, cold air with Oren hanging enormous overhead, not talking about anything important, just being two people from very different kinds of minds who've learned to trust each other's silence. I don't flinch at dead-comm channels the way I used to, not anymore, or at least not as badly. I still notice it, the specific quality of a radio that should carry a voice and doesn't. But now, more often than not, when that silence lands, my first thought isn't fear. It's readiness. Somewhere along the way, without quite noticing when it happened, I stopped being someone who got sent places by accident, and became someone this outpost genuinely needed, in exactly the way it needed me, not despite the fact that I couldn't hear 11 other minds agreeing with me, but because of it. There's a version of this story that ends with the Ithri deciding humans were secretly superior all along, and I want to be clear that this isn't that story, because I don't think that's true, and I don't think Sailorvan would let me get away with saying it even if I tried. What we are isn't better. It's just different in a way that happened, by pure accident of history and biology, to fill exactly the gap the Concord had figured out how to open. Someday, I suspect, some human unit somewhere is going to run into a crisis that a chorus link squad would have solved in a heartbeat and we won't, and it'll be some other liaison's turn to stand in that gap and figure out what they're actually capable of. For now, though, it's mine. And when the alarms are quiet and the moon is cold and Oren fills half the sky like something too vast to actually be real, I still climb up to that dented, ugly, stubborn relay dish, and I still check every connection twice, not because anyone tells me to, but because that's simply what I do. Nobody has to agree with me first. I've learned, finally, that they don't need to. That was never the point. The point was only ever to be ready to speak, clearly and alone, into whatever silence came next.